In this course, you will learn how to style HTML elements with CSS. Hey, how's it going guys? My name's Daniel, aka HashLips, and in today's video, like I said, CSS is our topic. Now, I recommend watching the HTML video that I released because we are going to actually do a continuation on that video, but this time we're going to implement the styles. You will find this very recognizable if you go and watch that video. I have reconfigured and laid out a simple HTML page for us to use to apply our styles and learn how to get started with CSS. Next, I want to mention this is how the page looks. It's very bland and our mission today is to style it up to look way better. I want to start off by talking about colors. This is a topic that not a lot of people understand, but when you do get it, it's very easy. So in order to learn about colors, the best way of doing so is going into Google and typing in color picker. Google off the bat gives us this nice color picker, and the reason why this is important because there are three main color channels or color variations and ways of writing and defining colors in CSS. The three ways are using hex, RGB, and HSL. You also can use other ones, but these are the ones I prefer and the ones I prefer to teach. Let's firstly look at the RGB. If you look at this section over here, you can see it's labeled as RGB and there's three values separated by commas. This represents the red, green, and blue fields. Thus the name RGB, red, green, and blue. Each one of these fields determine the amount of that color that's mixed together with the others, creating new colors. So for instance, if I slide this slider all the way to the left and then try and position it as far high here to the right, you can see that we have an amount of 255 of red. There are no green and there's no blue. That's a pure red color. Similarly, if we go to like a green, which is very difficult to get, but if we type it in here, if we say we want 0 red and we want the full amount of green and 0 blue, this is the green that we get. Now, these values range from 0 to 255, and we can do the same with blue, of course. So if we turn the red and the green to 0, we can turn this all the way up, and this is our blue. Now you can get different color variations. If you maybe add some green and let's add some red, we get this purple color. If we add more green, we get this light blue. If we turn the blue a bit down and maybe make it 80, we get to this half-toned green again. And that's basically how RGB works. That's how RGB works. It's by mixing three different color ranges. HSL, on the other hand, also mixes three values, but they stand for hue, saturation, and lightness. The hue ranges from a degree of 360 all the way to 0. This specifies your color. You can see that the hue changes, if you look here, that the hue changes from 0 to 360. The middle value here is the saturation. So if we bring the saturation down, so if we bring it down or to the left, you'll see that color changes as well. Then if we go up and down, this specifies the lightness, the last value. It's important to know the difference between RGB and HSL and when to use them. You sometimes want to use HSL to create kind of dynamic values because it's easier to play around with the lightness and the saturation. Between HSL and RGB, I would say RGB is more popular to use in the web space. You also get RGBA, A standing for the alpha, meaning that you can actually get transparent values, but we will talk about that when we get to styling in CSS. Let's take a look at the hex values. Hex values look like this. It is a hashtag followed by 6 characters, and these characters represent almost something similar to RGB, where the first 2 characters represent the red, the next 2 the green, and the last 2 the blue. You can see when I push up this to all the way red, RGB over here is 255, and the hex value is now FF for the two first characters. If we push the last color, which is blue, to 255, you can see that becomes FF2. It's just a different way in specifying a color range, and this is also popular in the web development space. I just wanted to explain colors so that when we do implement colors, you kind of understand where this all comes from and how to use it properly. With that information, we are ready to rock colors in CSS. I want us to take a quick look by right-clicking on the browser if we go to our hosted page, which you'll know how to do when you watch the previous video on HTML. Now, select any element, and I'm going to select this image. We can see that down here in the style section, we have things looking like this. We get the same if we select a paragraph. There's some p tag over there with curly braces and a few weird looking elements in here. This is called CSS, and it stands for Cascading Style Sheet. The reason why CSS has its name is to do with the fact that the last imported style sheet, or the last imported or defined style for a given element, will be taken, and the other ones will be overridden if it has the same styles. It is cascading, and it works with a hierarchy. So the at most important selector, if there is a very specific selector selecting an element and it's overwriting styles, it will take that style instead. This we have to explain in detail so you fully understand it. So let's now jump to the code. Like I said, I highly recommend watching the HTML video, because by doing that you'll understand exactly how we work with the structure that we are about to work with. As always, if you struggle with any part of the code, go to the HashLips.online website and join our social medias, especially our Discord server. You will find a lot of devs that can help you out if you incur any problems. Now, lastly, I just want to say, leave a thumbs up on this video and subscribe if you haven't. I put out content and I hope you guys enjoy it and learn so much from it. Then, I always read the comments, so let me know in the comment section what you think about this video, and let me know what you would like to see in future videos. Let's now jump right back into our tutorial. I'm going to create a new file in our root directory, and I'm going to call it styles.css. When you specify a file as a .css extension or with an extension .css, it tells the browser and also VS Code to treat it as such, and it makes it easier for us to write code because it would know what syntax works. I'm going to go ahead and write something out, some syntax of CSS and how to declare a style, and then get to explain it to you guys. So I'm simply going to add a background color, and we're going to make it aqua. Now, what is this weird syntax that you've seen over here? It is simple. CSS works with a selector, which is specified here in the beginning. In our case, this will refer to all of our p tags, our paragraph tags elements in this HTML file. We have to just link our CSS file here, and it should just work. But that is called the selector part. This is how you reach or select the element to apply the style to. Then we get the property that we are selecting over here and that we want to change, as well as the value on the right hand side of a colon. Each style statement is ended with a semicolon and lives inside a code block that goes towards the selector. So we can add more styles. We can, for instance, change the color as well, and let's make the color black. Now you can see that we've got two styles in our code block, and how do we know that these styles won't be applied to anything else? Well, it lives inside of these curly braces right after the selector. We can then go ahead and maybe apply this style to all the div elements in our HTML page, and also change the background color, but this time maybe we'll select blue. Now we know that all the divs would be blue background color, and all the p tags will have this with black text. If we save this, this is now saved in our styles.css, but if we go back to our browser, it won't show up on our page. And why is that? The reason for this is because we need some way for this page, this HTML page, to communicate and tell us that we need to use this style sheet. Let's now go ahead and link our styles file to the HTML page. We can do that by defining here at the very top in the head tags. We can specify another link, how we did, and linking our icon, our fav icon. This time, instead of saying that this is going to be an icon, we're going to say the rel is going to reference a style sheet, like so. Then we're going to add another attribute called the href to specify where this file lives. If you remember in the HTML series, we can simply specify that this lives in the same directory as this file. We can end our tag, save this, and go back to the browser. We can now see that all the p tags have this cyan, basically color, with black text. We don't have the blue backgrounds because we don't have any divs in our page, but if we were to wrap something in a div, for instance, we wrap this whole section over here, and we cut the div out, and we wrap this, we save it, we go back, we can see that this actually takes in that blue background too that we've specified here in our styles. Remember I said CSS is cascading and it takes the very last specified style, meaning that if we had another p tag specified over here and we made the background color pink, then it will actually take the pink background color but still keep this black color over here for the text, because technically our last style is only overwriting the background and not the color itself. Let me save this and go back to our website, and you can see that we now have a pink background. The same goes for the order that you import your style sheets. We can see that that color is being overridden if we right click and say inspect. So whenever you struggle with CSS and you want to know why styles aren't working, go to your Chrome browser, right click inspect, and select the element that's giving you trouble. Then here in the dev tools, you can see on the styles panel that our p tag has this style, but you can see that this color cyan, this aqua color, has been crossed out because it's being overridden by the most latestly specified background color over here. This one was defined last, and that's why it's overwriting the previous background color. That is a simple way of just debugging what's happening in your application. We can achieve the same thing by creating a new styles file. So I'm going to simply copy and paste our styles.css file and call this our styles2. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this red, and I'm going to go over into our HTML file, and I'm going to import our styles2 file, like so. Now we can see if we go back to our website that it actually took the red, because that whole style sheet has been imported last. Now if we right click and inspect, we can actually see that a lot of styles have been overridden. First, this was specified, then the background color, then it was overridden again, and then it was overridden to be red. This is very interesting, and it also shows you that you should work with styles with caution, making sure that you're not overwriting it, because it's quite difficult to understand what you overwrite and where it lives. This is only one way of referencing styles in your HTML pages. There are two other methods as well, which I'm going to get to right now. Just keep in mind that this is the way that cascading style sheets work, and it will take the last defined style for a given element that's been specified. Selectors will help us in that case to specify and make sure that we can identify unique elements and give them their unique styles. We'll get to that right after me explaining the different ways of importing and using CSS. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to remove the styles that we've added there, as well as in our styles file, remove the last p tag. I'm going to save this, make sure that everything is fine on our browser, and we have our cyan background color again. Then I'm going to go back, and we're going to take a look at the 3 different ways of using styles in HTML. So we have seen the first way of including styles in HTML by giving a link element the attribute and pointing it to your styles file over here. The next way of doing it is simply using the style element, open and close the bracket, and then simply write the style in here. So we can change the background color to, let's do it this golden color. And then once we've done that, we can go to the web page and see that it now has the golden color, even though we have an imported style over here, because it's cascading and this will be seen as the last style. Then we get inline styles, which is very important, and in this cascading style hierarchy, is taken very importantly, if I can put it like that. But basically what it comes down to, it takes that one into consideration above the imported methods. So for instance, if we wanted to give the whole body a style, all we need to do to apply styles to any element is specify the style attribute. Then let's stick with background color. We do it the same how we do it here, but we don't specify a body like curly braces. We specify the property and then the value. So technically, if we want to add a value there, we can turn the whole body gray. We end our statement with a semicolon, and then we can specify more styles in line. For instance, the color of all the text we can make green. We can carry on like this, and we do not have these curly braces, and that's basically how you do it inline. You can do the inline styles to any element you want to as well. It's generally best to keep inline styles to a minimal and rely more on style sheets, because you separate the code and it's nicer to actually look at it when it comes to selectors as well as maintain it. But that being said, let me save this page and show you that now we've got this gray background and all the elements colors, or the text colors that doesn't have a style yet, is now green. So I know I said that inline styles are very important, and yes, technically all styles are important depending on what kind of specificity they are listed as and what value the browser assigns to that element. Now, when we get to specificity, it's very important for us to understand selectors first. So in order for me to now explain to you selectors, I'm going to do a few examples and show you how it works. How do we select elements on an HTML page? How do we make sure that the specificity ranking is higher than the other ones to make sure that only that particular element gets that style? And here's a great example on this amazing link, which you can find here at the top. I'll go through this list once we get to the specificity, but I just wanted to show it off just now. I will be going back to the code, and now you at least know the 3 different ways of styling. I'm going to remove the inline styles because, like I said, I prefer us to use the linked way, where we link the style sheet separately, thus separating our code from the HTML. Alright, so let's take a look at selectors. Now, I've given you guys a few examples here just while we were talking, but let's get real and let's talk about selectors. I'm going to be showing you off different type of ways to identify an element on HTML to style. You can specify directly an element's name. For instance, you can call the body and actually put it as a selector, and what this will do is select the whole body element. Now the whole body wraps all of the content, so that would be the main wrapper. Now what you can do is basically, let's give this a background color. I'm not going to get into the different styles yet, just selectors for now. I'm going to turn it into this purple color. We can now see that the whole background of the body tag is purple. The body tag isn't the outermost wrapper of HTML, because if we look at our HTML structure, we can see that everything is wrapped in the HTML itself. So you can also go ahead and specify the HTML to give it a style as well. These are called the element selectors, and basically simply select elements. We can combine elements like these or any type of styles with a comma. For example, if we want the body as well as, and the body is not a good example, but let's give the divs, and we also want all the p tags and we also want all the a tags to have a background of, let's make it green. This way we can select multiple elements at once. and this is also a way you can select elements. So if we go back, we can see that all the p tags, the div tags, as well as even our link down here has now a green background. This is great, but what if we want to select specific elements via either a class or an ID? In order to do that, let's go and specify a few elements to have a class. I'm going to make this second paragraph sitting over here have a class, and we're going to call this class test for now. Maybe we can call it test class. Then I'm going to copy this class and paste it on this bottom paragraph as well. I then want to go ahead and actually, for this a tag over here, give it an ID. So the ID can be test ID. Now we can go ahead and specify to style either IDs or classes. So we can go back to our styles, and if we want to specify to style the test class, we specify that, or any class with a period symbol and then the name. So we have to type in test class. When we do so, let's change this background color to be this bright green. This will change all the test classes or any element with this test class attribute as a class into green. Now keep in mind, a class has a higher specificity than selecting normal elements. So even if an element says that the background should be this dark green, if we save this and go back, you'll see that the p tags that contain the class is actually bright green. And the reason comes down to the higher specificity or the accuracy that we are selecting elements. Classes are by nature a higher specificity, and it has a higher ranking than actual normal element selectors, which are these. Now that is great, but the ID has a greater specificity than a class, and I can prove that by, let's go grab the ID test ID. We're going to give the test ID a background color as well. Let's just type it out like so, and then I'm going to give it a hot pink. Now if I save this and go back to our website, we can see that this link does have this hot pink. But now let's say I go back to the HTML and I go actually take my ID from this a tag, and I'm going to remove it, and I'm going to specify it on this very first paragraph. I'm going to put the class as well as the ID. Which one will CSS select? Now if we save this and go back, we can see that the hot pink was selected because the ID has a greater specificity than a class. What we can also do with selectors is combine them. We can, for instance, select any of the p tags that actually has the class test class, and you specify it by doing it so. So we write the p tag and then we simply append the class. This will, in essence, basically select or apply these styles to any of the paragraph tags that contains the test class. If it's a normal paragraph tag, then it won't simply apply these styles. So let's go ahead and create a new background color for this, and let's make it this khaki color. Now that we have this, we can go to our HTML and let's see. Let's remove this from the p tag, and let's also actually remove this ID. So in essence, we have got two paragraphs here. One actually has the class test class and the other one doesn't. I'm going to save and go back to the website. We can now see that the normal paragraph tags without the classes still only contains the green background, but the paragraph with our class has the khaki color. Classes can also be applied to numerous elements. It doesn't have to be applied to only one, so I can apply it to a few of these. Now, taking in consideration that the H2 over here, our community title, seeing that it's not a p tag but an H2, it will simply only take in consideration this class. So I'm going to go back, save this, go back to our website, and now we can see that these p tags with the class has this khaki color, and then the one with just the class has the bright green color. Now I hope this makes sense, and it all comes down to a simple thing. It comes down to the fact that there's specificity happening. We get numerous ways of selecting elements, and let me quickly explore this list before we continue, because this is very important to understand so that you truly know what's happening with your CSS and to know where our styles gets applied. Now, talking about this list, you have seen the syntax. We get our element, in this case there's an li list element, and then we get the brackets for the styles. These are only the signatures of our CSS that we have over here. I'm going to run through that list so you see the different possibilities, but also see which ones are more important. If we go back to the website, we can go ahead and see that applying an asterisk as a selector means that it selects everything on the page, every element, and that has the specificity of 0. And this is how these kind of points work. As soon as you add to your specification, your narrowing it down, if I can put it like that, then the values increase and they get added, and that means the more or the higher the score, that style will be selected above the other ones that's lower. So the all selector has a very low specificity. Then we get to the elements. If we apply one element, which is one element, it counts as 1. Then if we have this kind of selector, which means that we have one element and one pseudo element, what does that mean? Well, pseudo classes are different, are a different situation at all. What this means is that, let's say for instance I have got a p tag and a pseudo class. A pseudo class is something like an action that can happen to an element on HTML. For instance, we get the hover as a pseudo class. Let me say that for any p tag on my page, if it's hovered over by the mouse basically, I want to change the background color to this coral color. If I save this and I go back to my page, let's go there, and I hover over these paragraphs, you can see that it changes. That's simply what they are meaning here by the first line or something like that. This is also a pseudo class. We will jump in detail into pseudo classes because they are really cool to use. But that being said, there are numerous ways of drilling down to a specific component. And once we do that, it's pretty cool. And as long as you understand kind of how these styles and the points work, then obviously you will know where styles gets applied. For instance, you can see that the style attribute that you usually specify inline is 1,000 points. That is a lot. So then you also get the IDs. So any ID that's being used that you've seen me use here is 100 points. And that's how it goes down the list. Now, it's not truly super important for you to understand this off the bat, and if you are boggled at this stage, please just bear in mind that this does take some time to understand, but you will understand this as long as you start working with CSS and getting used to which specificity overrides which one. Now, there are great resources which I'll reveal at the end of this course for you to go ahead and read up more on this, but in general, you would only need to start off by selecting IDs, classes, elements, and so forth, as well as inline styles. So seeing that this is our basic course, we are going to keep it as this. And for now, this is enough for you to know to make great websites. In CSS, it's important to write sometimes comments. You can specify a comment by putting a /, asterisk, and then a / again. This means you can write this is anything or this is a comment, right? And this is excluded from the styling. So you can put them anywhere in your code like this, and they won't affect these styles at all. You can use comments to communicate with your team members or anyone else looking at the code. Now I'm going to remove it because we don't need to comment out anything, but that's perfectly fine. I do, however, want to talk about something we talked way in the beginning, and that is the colors. We've been using words for colors, which is perfectly fine and can be used by CSS as well. But the most common use case are the hex, RGB, as well as HSL. Let me take and give you an example here. I'm going to select the cyan looking color, or maybe let's do this bright pink. I'm going to go ahead and select the hex value, which you can copy right there. It starts with the hashtag. Then I'm going to go to the code and replace this green-yellow color. Instead of this specific word for a color, I'm going to just simply put it like this: the hashtag and the hex value. Now, when I go back to my application and I save this, we can see that now the color of that background is bright pink. We can achieve the same result by using the RGB values down here. I'm going to copy all three values, the red, green, and blue, then go back to my code, and instead of using the hex, I'm going to simply write out RGB and then specify the values. You can see it picks up the pink color. I can go back and our website still has the pink background. Lastly, we can also look at the HSL. This is how it looks. So now what we can do is go back to our code, and instead of using RGB, we can use HSL, and we need to replace these values in here like so. We can get rid of this degree. Now you can see that we have that exact same pink color, and this is perfectly fine. One thing that I do want to mention with the RGB is that if I just go back and I use RGB like this, you also get the RGBA, A representing the alpha. So if I specify a number between 0 and 1, so let's make it 1 or 0.5, this will have an alpha on it, meaning that it is 50% opacity. We can verify that it is opaque by hovering over this in Visual Studio Code, and we can also see that its opacity scale is sitting at 50%. We can play around with it, but this is how RGBA colors with an alpha works. Now we are going to be focused on hex values most of the time, so you'll see me go a lot more back and forth between this color picker, seeing that we are about to style our page. This is now where the fun is going to start. I'm going to remove almost everything that I've done in here so that we can start from scratch. Now that you've seen how selectors work, there's no point in me keeping that code. I'm also going to remove the test classes over here as well as these ones, because from this point onwards we are going to do this properly and actually style it to look somewhat decent. Now that we have all the little tags out of here, we do have our linkage to the styles page. We're ready to go. I'm going to show you how to kind of use divs and styles in a nice way so that we can get a full picture on what we want to style and making the page look amazing. I'm going to start off by talking about background images and how to apply a background image to our page. In order to do this, I will need a container to use. So I'm going to specify a div tag with its opening over there and wrapping all the content that is sitting inside the body. So now we have our opening tag there, and I'm going to give it a class. So you need to do it inside as a tag. And then this class is going to be the content. Now the content is specified to be a class, and I just like using classes instead of IDs, but I'm going to do this interchangeably so that you can see how to work with both. For now, let's go and create our class in our styles.css. Remember, we can make a class selector by putting a period in front of the word. Let's test if this worked by just simply setting the background color to something. We can see that our style is applied to the content class, which is wrapping all of our content. Now, for instance, what do we want to do with this background? Let's say we want to add a background image and we want to do it in CSS. Let me show you how you can apply a background color instead of an image. Here is a list of all the background properties that we can play around with. You've seen me set the background color quite a bit, so I'm going to remove it now. Next, each one of these properties, remember, accepts a colon and then the value. The value that we can supply for a background image, and let me just comment out the rest of the properties, otherwise it won't work. So I'm going to set the background image to a URL. You can specify the URL like that, and then inside here we need to provide it a path. We're going to say our path is going to be in the same directory, images, and then my GIF. Yes, we can put a GIF as a background image. Let's save this and go back to our website. Now we can see we actually have a big GIF as our content background. You can also see that there's a big white space around our content. That I'll show you how to fix when we deal with margins and padding, but for now just leave it like this. Our biggest concern is actually having this image fit the content so it doesn't look that stretched or big and cutting out of this screen. We also get another interesting property called the background size. Now background size can take a few different values like contain, cover, and if we go down we also get the inherent and all those default ones. But let's say contain and see what happens. Now if we go back to our website, we can see that it actually contains our image. It tries and fits as much of this image as it can inside of our container and depending on the width of our screen. But you can see something interesting happening. It's basically repeating our image. So let's say that we don't want this to repeat. That's why we have this background repeat property. I'm going to uncomment this and then comment these two, and for the repeat, say that it should not repeat by placing a no repeat. When we go back, you can see that it doesn't repeat, but it doesn't really stretch to the full length of our, or the full width of our div. And we want it to stretch to the fullest that it can. You can go ahead and use cover or play around with a size that matches that you would like to use. Cover simply covers the whole page and make sure that your image fits and is always covering each part of the div or the container that is specifying the style. We can also try to use auto and see what auto will do. If we specify it as auto, then it goes and it just blurs it out to the fullest of the extent, which is probably something we don't want. Maybe we can stick with cover for now, and then let's go ahead and use these two styles as well. You can think of attachments as a more advanced concept in adding, scroll capabilities for your image and the content and so on, but we're not going to look at that for now. That's more advanced stuff. Now what we can do is position and use the position of our background, so we can actually position it and say we want this to be center. Once we do that, we can go back, and now with the cover and the center, we can actually see that our image is trying to center itself and cover the full page. This looks a little bit better, but you can play around with these kind of parameters to find the desired effect you want to. Sometimes it's better to use an image and overlay it over content, or pull it into the background instead of changing the background image like so. But this is how you do images with background styles. Seeing that we want to start styling our page to look beautiful, this is not so much beautiful, but it is valid to show you how to add a background image, and you can add an image or a GIF in there if you want to. Now I'm going to focus on another style, and these are the borders. Now we can define a border by styling these three properties: border-width, border-style, and border-color. When it comes to the width, I'm simply going to provide it a pixel width. So we can say that we want this border to be about 3 pixels. Pixels are values used to specify on how thick or how big the size should be, or how many pixels it should take up of the screen. So this is going to be a 3 pixel wide border. Then we're going to specify the style. For styles, you get a bunch of styles. You get dotted, dash, and I'll leave you to go and play around with it. For now, I'm going to just choose the solid one. Then we get to the color. Now let's jump back to our browser and pick a color for our border. I'm going to choose this dark blue. I'm going to copy the hex code, go back and put the hex code for my border over there. Once I save this, I can go back to my web page, and now our content should have a border around it. For some of these CSS properties, you get shorthand methods. How they work is you specify it all in one line. So all of this technically can be defined like so. We can say border, 5 pixels should be the width, our style should be solid, and our color should be red. When we do that, now we've got a red border. So that's pretty cool. Now the thing is, we still have this white space around it. And how do we get rid of this white space? It's time we discuss margins and padding. If you right click on the page and you say inspect and go to the compute tab, you can see this box that you've seen before. What is this box and how does it work? Well, CSS uses the box model to style elements or components that we give styles to. How does this work? Well, the box model exists by if we select any component. Let's select this component over here with the red border, the div, and you can see it selected over there with the class content. Now, if we look at this box, you can see there's this number 5 on the border. And that is because we have specified the border as being 5 pixels wide. We can see that this box represents this element that's just selected. Obviously, we can see a clear indication of a 5 pixel border. Then the margin has a dash, meaning there's no style apply or there's no size to it. Inside the border, we get the padding, and then we get the content that makes up the bulk of the element. If you understand the box model and basically how it works, you will understand CSS and it would be super easy for you. I would recommend spending some time going and opening these developer tools, selecting random elements. For instance, this image. We can see that the image has no margin, border, or padding, but it is a height and a width of 200. Then we can go ahead and maybe select this title. This title indeed actually has a default margin. Remember, the margin sits outside of the border. So as long as you can understand that margins are outside the border, padding is inside closer to the content, and the content itself sits inside the padding. This is good to understand because when it comes to styles and you need to move things around, it's easier to think about what kind of style to apply for a given situation. It's good practice to use the developer tools to find out what styles are applied to elements if you're not sure what they have on. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I'm going to take this selector tool and try and select the outer container. This is the HTML element. We can see that indeed there's nothing applied over here. So maybe there's something applied to the body element. Let's select the body, and yes, there is. We can see that there's a margin. Now, if I hover over it, you can actually see the margin being highlighted, and we can get rid of that. A good practice to do in CSS before you start is to kind of reset the padding and the margin of all the components. I like doing that by using the asterisk selector and then just saying margin 0 and padding 0. Remember, margin is outside the border and padding is inside the border. When I do so and save and I go back, I can see that everything sits flush. Even my titles, my paragraph as well as my H tag is close, sitting close to next to each other because they don't have any margins applied to them anymore. To convey my message clearly, I'm going to go ahead and create a new style. I'm going to remove my commented out borders because I have my one-liner border here. Then I'm going to go ahead and put a style on the body element itself. Remember, the body element is this top level one. Now we've got our div with the class of content, and now we've got the body that we're going to style as well. This time I'm also going to give the body a border. But I'm going to make this border green so we can see the contrasting colors easily. We can now see that we have a red border for the div and a green border for the body. So if we select the div, there it is, and the body outside here is the green border. I'm going to use the body to actually explain the box model to show you where the margin sits and the padding sits, as well as the content. I want you to realize that the styles that we are about to apply can be applied to any HTML element. We are going to apply a margin to the green box, meaning we are going to technically apply the margin to the body tag. So let's go to our code and let's go into the body styles that we've defined. Here we can see there's a green border already, and all we need to add now is a margin, and we're going to make it a 20 pixel wide margin. So if we specify the margin property just like that, it means it's going to apply the size of 20 pixels all around this element. And remember, a margin sits outside of the border, so it would technically recreate that white space looking like it's pushing in the content. Let me save this and go to our website. Here we can see now there's a clear white border, or a clear white space, I should say, outside of the green border. This is called the margin of our body element now, because that's where we applied it. You can see when we go to the box model down here, we have our border, which is 5 pixels in size, as well as our 20 pixel margin right round. And this is great for when you want to space content and give a little bit of a margin between elements. You don't only have to always specify margin and have all these sides have a margin. You can specify which side you want to have a margin to. So we can go back and say we want the margin top to be 40 pixels. We can also say that we want the margin left to be only 10 pixels. I'm going to save this and go back. Notice that I've specified margin, and then because I overwrite the left and the top, it will still apply, and you can see the result over here. We can see that the top clearly has a bigger margin and the left side has a smaller 10 pixel margin, and it's indicated here in our box. So now we can go ahead and look at how can we do this all in one line as well. We can achieve the same result by specifying everything in one line. We can simply say that we want the margin to have a 40 pixel top margin. Then we go to the right hand side, almost like a clock. So we start at the top, 40 pixels for the top, for the right hand side 20 pixels, for the bottom 20 pixels, and for the left hand side 10 pixels. You can specify it like this, and this becomes like a one-liner. When we save, we can go back and see that it has exactly the same result. Let's go and even this out and give it an equal 20 pixels. I want to keep it like this because I want to explain padding. Now let's briefly look at what we have, and we can see that our green border has now a margin outside of it. But what if we wanted the content inside the green border to be squashed in? This is called the padding, and how we specify it is exactly the same as margin. We can simply write padding, and this time let's give it a 30 pixel padding. When we save it, we can go back and see that there's now a space between the red and the green border. This is technically the padding of the body, this green border element. But we can apply this, as I said, to the red border one, to this image, to any of these tags, and it will have the same result. Let's double check what we have done. We can select this element, the body element, and we can actually see that we've got a margin on the outside of the border. We've got the border itself, padding on the inside, and the content. Now, this is the box model perfectly explained. So what will happen if we wanted to add some spacing between this red border and the content inside of that? Well, it makes sense. Let's go and select the red border. We can see that it has no margins or padding. What would make sense is to apply padding if we want to specify a space between the content and the border. So let's go and go to the code. We're going to add a padding, and let's add a padding of 20 pixels. Keep in mind, with padding, you can also do it in a one-liner. You can also do left, right, bottom, and top. So you can do exactly the same with padding that you can do with margin. Now, if we go back, you can see that the content actually now has a padding. We can show that by selecting it over here. There's the border, and there's the padding. We can also give it its own margin. So if we go into the code and we just copy that margin, put it over there, we go back, you can see that there's a very big space here between the green and the red border. But that being said, these are two different sizes. We get the red, and the red has its own margin, and the green element has its own padding. That's why the padding plus the margin creates that big space of these two elements. I hope this makes sense and that you understand padding and margin, because I'll be using it a lot in this series going forward to style certain elements. I'm going to remove the styles from the green border and this body altogether. I'm going to save it, and then we're going to go back and see how it looks. We can see that we now only have the red box, and it has a margin as well as a padding. I want to now start styling my page so things start making sense. I'm going to go back and remove the margin because 20 pixels is more than enough. We can go back and see that our margin is gone, but our content at least has a padding inside, so it's not sitting to the edge. Now this is good, but I need a black background. If I give this box with the border the background, only this will have my black background and not the rest. For instance, if I apply the background over here, save it, this is not the desired effect because I want my whole page to have this dark background. So a better place to put this would be, if we go back to the code and remove that, would be the HTML itself. So I'm going to put this on the HTML, give it the black background, save it, and go back. Now we can see that the HTML, seeing that it is the whole page, has the black background. We can also see that this has the padding with this box, and this box only stretches as big as the content gets. You don't always have to stick with the default width and height that HTML gives you. We can go ahead and restyle our box, and if we want to make it a width of 300 pixels, we can do so. We can save, go back to our page, and we can see that this is 300 pixels wide. We can also alternatively work with percentages, and a percentage takes in place and takes in consideration its outer container. So seeing that this content is sitting inside the body, if we give it a 60%, or let's make it 50%, if we give it a 50%, save it and go back, this container would take up 50% of the available space of the page. And that is how you can work with pages and sizes when it comes to width. Now it's interesting, if we inspect this, you can see that it still scales down. This is because usually when you work with responsive content, you would work with percentages in some cases. Using percentages takes in consideration the outer box. For instance, if we had a style like this, and this was called our inner container, so maybe inner dash container, or we can also use camel case like this, and we made this border color, let's make it a blue. And this also has the same values. We can get rid of the padding maybe, like so. And then let's go and use this class. In our HTML, we can go ahead and create another div element to wrap our content. Now I want to give this div the class, and the class name is going to be inner content. And then I'm going to grab this and maybe wrap this heading and this paragraph. When I go to my website, I can see there it is. Now it becomes clear to us that the red container only takes up 50% of the body, and the blue container, this blue border container, takes up 50% of the available space in this red container, seeing that it's living inside of it. That's why if we go back to the code and we go ahead and now specify that this blue container should be maybe 100%, and we go back, we can see now it stretches to the full amount. We can see that something strange is happening over here to the blue container. Indeed, it's stretching 100%, but it's not taking in consideration the padding that's defined by this container over here. That's because it's trying to stretch 100% and it kind of overlays and squashes the content over here, and you can clearly see that that 20 pixel padding is not applied. We can verify this by right-clicking, inspecting the page, and then going and selecting the elements. Just hover over the page and you can see that there's this green kind of container and it's cutting into that border down there. Now, how can we resolve that so that it keeps in mind the padding that it needs to use? Well, we can simply use auto. So if we specify this field, the width field, as auto, it's going to try and take up the most available space that it technically can. And if we go back, we can see that our padding is now working perfectly fine. We have equal spaces for that blue container. Now, like I said, understanding padding and margins and playing around when to use which one, it only comes with real experience, because you might find, and there's no real right way of doing it, but you might find that in some instances, certain things work better than others. When it comes to height, that's a bit more tricky, especially if you have an outer surrounding box. Let's say we want this red box to be 100% of the height. You will imagine, and maybe you might try doing something like this, putting this to 100% of height. If we go back, this doesn't change anything because it doesn't know what 100% is of this page, because a page can scroll to infinity. You can use 100% height only if the outer container already has a defined height. For instance, if we use vertical height, the VH appended here to the 100, we can say that this should indeed scale to the 100% of this page. Now, the reason why it has a bit of scroll is because we also have the padding inside of here. But now that we have a defined height and we can actually right-click inspect, and once we select this component, we can see that it computes and it indeed has a set height. Once we have that, we can actually close this and go back to the code. And then if we want to specify a height for the inner content, we can say height should now be 100%. This will technically work because we already have a height defined for this outer container. Keep in mind, like I said, using percentages, it will try and do that and then squash the content because it needs to take that space. So a better alternative is to use, in some cases, auto if you really need the content to stretch and be the fullest that it can be. I'm going to remove the inner content's height as well as this height and the width, because we don't really need to set it, seeing that if we do this by default, it will stretch to the available space. I'm going to go ahead and remove the red container's border because we now know how it sits on top of this page. Let's go and remove the border and then we'll keep the contents pixels to that. I want to change this color of this border in the inner container to be a green. I want a nice neon green, and the reason for that is I want to style like this kind of coding website. So that would be a good green, and then for the pixel size I want to maybe make it only 2 pixels. We can save this and go back and check at how it looks. That still might be a little bit harsh, so what I'm going to do is go back again, dim my color a bit to be something like that, and maybe make it 1 pixel. I also want to show you that you can use, instead of solid, you can use dashed. And if we do that and save, we can go back, you can see these little dashed lines. But for now, we're going to keep it as a solid. We can also barely read the text because it's dark too. So what we would like to do is actually choose a white color for all of our text. Now, if you specify a font color, and you do that by specifying just the keyword color, and if you do that, it's going to specify a color for the text. I want to use the hex value, and the hex value for white is basically if. And once you've applied that, the whole page should have this white color. Now we can see that it's way more readable. Now, colors can range just like any styles. If I were to specify a different color for this container here, the green border container, by simply placing another color value inside the inner content, and then let's change it up and make it this red. I can save that and go back and see that it takes on that color for the font. That is pretty cool. So you can have different colors of fonts all over your page. I'm going to try and get a green color that works for our page, seeing that we are trying to make a code looking page. I can copy this and maybe remove that, seeing that we want to do it to the whole page, and put the RGB value in here. I might want to make it a lighter green because it will read better. So maybe something like that. Save it, go back and check it out. This is pretty cool. It's very hard to read still, so I think we can maybe dim it down a little bit. Maybe to something like that. Now if we go back, that's way better. The green font looks cool, but the actual style and font family is not cool at all. So we want to change that. You can do that by going to any HTML element and specifying a font family like so. These are some of the popular Cody looking font families that I like. I prefer monospace, so I'm going to maybe put monospace here in the beginning and put a comma. You might wonder, why do we have 3 fonts defined instead of 1? The reason why we specify 3 is so that we have fallback fonts to fall back on if the first one wasn't selected. CSS will try and get monospace and then go on to the next and the next font in that order. Now keep in mind, these are web fonts and they are readily available on the browser already. You can do custom fonts by importing them as well. This is what we have so far. But you can see everything is squashed, and with our knowledge of what we've learned, I'm going to apply this now and then see how we can make this look a bit more presentable. Let's jump back into the code, look at the HTML page first. We've got this content div, and then we got this header with 2 paragraphs. Now we also then have an image and then another div, which is the inner container. I'm going to go ahead and first specify to the inner container some padding because it's too close to that border. I'm going to provide it maybe a padding of 10 pixels. So I'm going to say padding, and we want it to be all round 10 pixels. Save that and let's check how it looks. It looks a bit better because it has a little bit of a space. We still need to create spaces between our headers and our paragraphs, and I feel like our paragraph text is a little bit too big. So let's go and change that. I'm going to create a selector for the p tags, which are the paragraphs, as well as the h2. For that, I'm going to make a font size of, let's say, 20 pixels to start off with. For the p tags, I'm going to put a font size of maybe 10 pixels. Let's save this, go back, and we can see that it's a lot smaller. I feel like we can maybe up the paragraph. So let's go and make this maybe 12 pixels. Then, seeing that the headings are a bit too close to the paragraphs, I'm going to add to all the headings a margin bottom of maybe 10 pixels, as well as the paragraphs. But for the paragraphs, let's make it a smaller size, like 5. When I go back, we can see that the headings have now a little bit of a space, and the paragraphs too. I think we can get away with increasing the paragraph spacing to maybe something like 8 pixels. When we have a look at that, we can clearly see that these are 2 paragraphs. We can also change the link text down here because it's barely readable. So we can go back and create a style for our link tag. we can kind of make it the same size as a paragraph, or maybe a little bit smaller, like 10. And for the bottom margin, nothing. And maybe for the color, we can use the same green, but this time make it a lot lighter. Let's go back, and now we can see our link is like a bright green. Maybe to enhance the page, we can add some border radius to this container. We can also remove the underscore from this link element because it looks ugly, and we can do it by removing the text decoration. Let's first apply a border to that inner content with the green border around it. We can specify a border radius by typing in border radius, and let's give it a 10 pixel or maybe an 8 pixel border radius. For the link tag, I'm going to, and it's defined by the A, if you remember that, then we're going to set the text decoration to be none. Doing this will remove that underscore, and also we're now going to have a border radius. Here we can see we don't have that sharp corner on our border over there anymore, and we don't have the underscore on our link. Let's maybe remove our image and place it inside of this container as a background. I think that would look pretty cool, and we can do some cool hover effects with it too. We can maybe make that into our warning box, and also maybe include our link just so that people can link to whatever we want to send them to. So let's start off by going to the HTML, grabbing our link over there, and cutting it out and putting it inside of our div. I'm simply going to use a line break for this because I want it to be on the next line, the link tag. Once I've done that, I can go back and we can see that the link is indeed now in there. We can now get rid of our image over there because in the CSS styles, in our inner content, we are now going to set the background image. And we need to specify the background image, and we're going to give it a URI or URL. And basically this just points to where the image lives. Now we have images, and I'm going to select the GIF. We can also set the background size, and I think we need to do cover so that we make sure that it covers the full one. Let's see what happens. If we go back, we can now see that our image basically covers the full extent of this div or this container. The GIF looks a bit out of place, so I've created a special banner image long enough to fit there easily. I'm going to replace this, and this is going to be called the banner.png. When we go back, we can now see that this looks way better. Maybe the text can still be more prominent, so we can try and make it even lighter, almost like this link color, and this might work. So let's go and try that out as well. Let's go and grab this color of the link and apply this to this inner content specifically. If I go back, I can now see that it's way more readable and stands out from the background. We can definitely darken the image even more to make it even more readable. But for now, this is fine, and if we inspect the page, we can see that this scales quite nicely too. Let's go and place our mask image inside of this container. Maybe we can have it on the right hand side or even here on the top. I'm going to show you how to use position to achieve this. We're going to go back to the HTML, grab our image, cut that out, and place it inside our inner content div that's tagged with this inner content class. We're going to save it and go to the CSS styles. Over here, in order to make something position absolute, meaning that we are going to absolutely set this at a position. Currently how it stands, if we go back and refresh, you'll see that it's inside the container. But it's sitting here at the top, and we need to kind of position it around. What do I mean by positioning something as absolute? Well, let's go to the code and into CSS, and let's actually go and attach to this image a new class. We're going to give it a class. I'm going to call it the mask. Now we have a mask class, and in CSS I can specify it maybe over here. I can say that the mask, and usually you can say mask image, which would be better. Let's keep to convention, so maybe mask image, and we can do it like so. Go back, save this, And then once we have this, we can go and apply some styles. The style that I want to apply is the position style. Now with position, you get absolute, fixed, relative, static, and a whole bunch of others. I'm going to focus on position absolute. Once I do this, I can now go ahead and use this. Remember, when you're defining a class in CSS, you have to put the period sign. When we have this as position absolute, check what happens now. We can see the mask overlapping this container. This is because now that the mask has a position of absolute, it disregards the structure of HTML. Usually the structure is layering something below each other, almost like a stack. And if you position something as absolute, it's now positioning itself wherever it wants to on the page. We can go ahead and play around with this by specifying a left like so and a top. I'm going to say from the left hand side, I want this image to be 100 pixels like so. From the top, I want this to be specified as only 20 pixels. If I save this and go back, I can see that it's 100 pixels from the left and only 20 from the top. We can even make it go further from the left hand side by giving it maybe 400, and let's specify 200. Now if we go back, you can see it's 400 from the left and 200 from the top. Currently, if this image is wrapped in some kind of div and there is no relative position specified for it to attach to, it will take the whole entire page to determine where it should position itself. In order to tell it that it needs to be relative to this container only, not the page itself, we can simply apply the position relative inside the inner content. So even though this position is applied to the mask image, we still need to say that we're going to apply a position relative to the inner content. When we do that and we save, we go back, you can see it's kind of pushed down. This is because now it's 400 from the left and 200 from the top, but it's taking it from this container's values. That's why if we zero these out, we can see that it would stick to this container, like so. We can now go ahead and make this look good by pinning it here on the right top hand side. So I'm going to make it overlap slightly so it also looks quite cool, and how we achieve that is by specifying that from the right hand side we want it to be 0 pixels, and let's start off like that, and for the top we want it to be 0 pixels as well. Once we save it, we can go back and we see that it's trying to position itself over here. Now we can play around with the size of the image. Instead of defining the size in the image like so, I think I'm going to take that out and specify a width over here. I'm going to make the width maybe 50 pixels. Then on the right hand side, I'm going to put it into the minus, going over and bleeding over the border, maybe minus 10 pixels. For the top as well, minus 10. I'm going to save this, go back, and here we can see we got this mask and it's kind of overlapping, which is quite cool. We can see that this is now overlapping, but to prevent other elements from crashing into it, seeing that there is a very little space here at the top of this container, we can simply add maybe a 5 pixel margin to the inner container over here. We can basically go ahead and say we want a margin, and this is going to be a margin top only of 5 pixels. When we do that, it kind of pushes the content a little bit more down. So if I save this and refresh, let's make it obvious. So let's maybe make it 20 so you can see. Now you can see there's a 20 gap between each of these elements that takes this in. So what will happen is if we duplicate this in our HTML, so for instance, if we duplicate this inner container 2 times and we save it and we go back, we can see that now we've got a nice looking kind of frame that holds them and they don't overlap here at the top. Let's now say we want to order this going from left to right in a row, and we don't want these elongated cards. We can simply use something called Flexbox for this. Now I highly recommend going through this Flexbox article on CSS tricks It's an amazing website to up your skills in CSS. In the beginning, Flex and using Flexbox might seem daunting and challenging altogether, but it's super simple. It comes down to displaying something as flexible. Putting elements next to each other in a row, wrapping them, putting them in a stack, in a column, kind of playing around with the layout altogether. How you would achieve this is by wrapping your items in a container that has a display of flex like so. Let's start off by doing it to our content and see what we want to wrap. We want to go ahead and wrap this in a content. Basically, each one of these divs ranging from here to here, we actually want to wrap all of them in a container itself. So I'm going to create a new div. Then I'm going to end the div right here at the bottom where these end, wrapping them in essence. So if we collapse these, we can see that we basically have 3 elements of this inner content item. I'm going to go ahead and create a new class. This class I'm going to call the Flex container. Now you can call it whatever you want to call it. I'm just going to call it container for now. Go to my CSS styles, save this page, and create a new style for Flex container. My Flex container is going to be display Flex. So once we do that, the default is that our items will now be displayed in a row. So here you can see what I mean. They all follow each other, next to each other, and kind of tries and fits into the available space that it has. Now with Flexbox, it is way more than just this. You get to define how much space each one should take up. For instance, we can specify a flex value to each one of these elements and then make it flex in certain kind of sizes. Let me explain this in code. Each one of these boxes are the same size. But what if we have gone ahead into our HTML and said this first element over here, we would like to give it a style, and the style is going to be a flex. And this flex is going to be of 1. The next one, we want to give the same style, but this time we're going to make it 2. So we're going to say this one flex is 2. And the last one, 1 again. We are in essence telling the CSS to give twice as much space to the middle container than the ones on either side. If we go back to our browser, we can see that this one in the middle is indeed twice as big as the ones on the left and the right side. Now you can play around with these values and you can simply make this one 2 or even 4. This time saying that we are taking 4 fractions, then 2 and then 1. So if we save this, you can see that it gives this one the biggest space. What if we didn't want to flex all of these containers the same width and actually only wanted to flex the very last one, because these ones we can give a particular size? We can do the same. So I'm going to give a style and a particular width to this specific one of 30 pixels. It's very thin, but we'll see how it turns out. The second one I'm going to do the same, and the last one's going to flex only 1. This time we can go back and we can see that these two take up 30 pixels and this big one stretches as far as it possibly can. Now this is the kind of value that you get by using Flexbox. There's a lot more to it, and I'm going to set up a dedicated video just for Flexbox, seeing that this is so cool and I use it almost all the time to style and kind of organize my elements. We get to align things, and let me show you quickly how that works as well. Let's imagine that all of these had the same style. So for the example, I'm going to make each one of these 50 pixels wide. Now there's no flex involved, so what will happen? They will still be row, but they will be now ordered next to each other like so. We want to space them out, and to achieve this you can use the kind of justify content variable and use some of these parameters to stretch out your content. The justify content works in the main axis. So if your direction is row, which it is by default, it would go from left to right. If your direction was column, then it would have gone from the top to the bottom. But technically, behind the scenes with CSS, what happens when you display something as flex, you get the flex direction. And this is by default set to row. You can also set this to column. So if we decide to go to column and we run our browser, you can see that they stack on top of each other. Now let's leave it to the default, which is row, but I'm going to explicitly put it like this. For this time, I'm going to say justify content and let's make them all center. Now we will see that they all sit here in the middle. You can see, and by looking at this article, you have a lot of options to choose from. Instead of center, let me use space between. This will try and give space between each element that you have in this flex box. So if we go back, you'll see that now there's space in between, and for some use cases, this might be useful. Obviously, we don't like this look, and I'm going to undo what I've done here with these styles and not give them anything at all. By default, these should stretch with a flex of 1. So when we leave this, even if space between is there, they will still try and take up the most available space. If we scroll down on this article, we also get the align items, which can align items in certain ways that you want to. But like I said, this is the beginning course of CSS, and I'll get to a dedicated course with Flexbox. It's really worth it diving into this. Now, I just want to show you what can happen if we want to create a little bit of a gap. So let's use this gap to create a gap between our elements, because this is way too close. So if we go back to our styles, we can simply now go to the place where we have our content and just specify a gap. Let's make the gap 20 pixels, seeing that that's kind of the value that we use all over the place. How beautiful does that look? It looks nice, and it's also scalable. Let's right click and inspect the page so we can test out how flexible and responsive this really is. It works quite great, but up until a certain point. When it gets this thin, the content's not really readable anymore and it bleeds off the page. But let's go and specify a minimum width that these should be. I would like these to be kind of this as a minimum width, so I'm going to select it, see what the width is, and it's about 200. We can jump back into the code, and then for this inner container, let's give it a static width. We're going to say this width is not going to be auto anymore, but we're going to say let's make it 200 pixels. Let's save this and look at our content. When we look at it like this, it's all spaced out. Now we can inspect this and we can see if we try and scale it, it will go and scale. That's why we need to give it a minimum width and a maximum width to kind of facilitate the minimum that it can be. So I'm going to change this width into the minimum width. And when I say minimum dash width, like so, that's going to be 200 pixels. This means that it will not go smaller than 200 pixels at all, but it will scale up to the fullest extent if it needs to. We can also go ahead and maybe give it a max width and then say the max width should be 400 pixels. This means that it would try and scale up and down, but it will only ever be 400 pixels wide. So you can see that it's going to scale up and down, but it will stop at some point. Let's add the parameter to our container now and make it wrap. We can simply add the flex wrap property, and by doing this, when it detects that it cannot fit in the available space anymore, it will technically start wrapping. We can remove the space between of the justify content in order to render it more nicely. So this time it will wrap, but it will keep to the left hand side. This looks cool and all, but what if we wanted to center everything? We can go back and maybe focus on the content div, seeing that that wraps all of our content. We can go in there and make this display flex. By default, this is going to display in a row fashion. We need to not have it display as a row, but rather have the flex direction be column. We can also line the items center, and then we can go ahead and check the results. So now we can see this is aligned center and these not so much. Why is that? Because technically it is. We just need to kind of define that these p tags, these paragraphs, need to align center as well. And we can do that either in the CSS, but let's go and apply some inline styling. I'm going to say that we need a style, and this is going to be text align center, which will center the text. I'm going to just replace this p tag as well to have the same style. If we go back, we can see that the paragraphs here are now centered. This whole container is not centered, but we can center it as well. What we can do is in our CSS file, where we have specified this flex container, we can go and say justify the content center, because remember we are working with the flex direction of row. Justifying content works with the main axis. And if we go back, we've got this centered kind of look and feel. And there we go. We have a beautiful looking page. And you now know enough about CSS basics to go ahead and experiment with CSS yourself. I hope you guys enjoyed my basics course, and let me know in the comments if you want to see more advanced concepts such as using Flexbox as well as doing interesting things with animations. I would be glad to create those videos for you. Also, just leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed my content, and remember to subscribe because it really helps me out, and I do appreciate each and every one of you. Now, lastly, I just want to say for extra resources, go to W3 Schools and click on this CSS part. You will find that there's a lot more to CSS that meets the eye, and you can learn all about this by going through and teaching yourself the advanced concepts too. I hope to see you guys in my next video. Thank you for everything. Cheers for now.